Well, given the West's action with regard to Ukraine and Russia, you're starting to see a bunch of financial moves that are really, really important. So India is starting to realign with Russia for a bunch of very realpolitik reasons. You started to see foreign banks that are starting to move away from the US dollar because, after all, one of the measures that was taken during this crisis was the West basically freezing all foreign asset accounts of the Russians. So if they had dollars, we just froze the dollars. Okay, so that means that if you are China, for example, you are immediately attempting to get into gold, right? Something fungible that is not going to be held hostage by digital denominations at some sort of foreign bank. So that is going to have a major impact. Meanwhile, as the West continues to try to woo Iran in the most bizarre and self-defeating policy I've seen really since the Obama administration, it's so unbelievable that they are attempting to make overtures to the Iranian Ayatollahs at a time when their chief broker is the Russians. And while the Iranians are firing missiles at American consulates in Iraq, and meanwhile, driving away many of the major oil-producing areas on planet Earth, like Saudi Arabia, for example, or UAE, like, what are you doing? What are you doing? You're so high, you are so up your own butt at this point that you think that you're smelling roses. That ain't roses, okay? I honestly do not know what this administration thinks they are doing, other than that they are so deeply believing in their own stupid ideas that they fail to recognize that the world has repudiated those ideas over and over and over. And it's not just the United States, by the way. Apparently, Britain is now looking at ways to pay a £400 million, that's $522 million debt to Iran, according to the foreign secretary in Iran. The debt was widely believed to be linked to the detention of UK dual nationals. Iran is releasing some of those dual nationals, and apparently Iran is now going to be releasing $500 million for Iran to fund terrorism to pay for hostages. Meanwhile, the United States continues to draw closer and closer to a garbage Iran deal that is likely to massively increase the ability of the Iranians to fund terrorism. And that deal is also likely to include carve-outs for Russians doing business with Iran. So you have the Indians doing business with Russia. You have the Russians doing business with Iran. And meanwhile, what is that leading to? Well, that's leading to countries like Saudi Arabia saying, well, what if we just don't want to help out the United States as much anymore? What if we need to triangulate with China? Because obviously the United States is siding with Iran. So don't we need to hedge our bets? According to the Wall Street Journal, that's precisely what's happening. Saudi Arabia is now in active talks with Beijing to price some of its oil sales to China in yuan. People familiar with the matter said, a move that would dent the U.S. dollar's dominance of the global petroleum market and mark another shift by the world's top crude exporter toward Asia. The talks with China over yuan-priced oil contracts have been off and on for 6 years, but have accelerated this year as the Saudis have grown increasingly unhappy with decades-old U.S. security commitments to defend the kingdom. The Saudis are angry over the U.S.'s lack of support for their intervention in the Yemen civil war, which is funded by the Iranians, and over the Biden administration's attempt to strike a deal with Iran over its nuclear program. Saudi officials said they were shocked by the precipitous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan last year. China buys more than 25% of the oil Saudi Arabia exports. If priced in yuan, those sales would boost the standing of China's currency. Right now, the Saudis demand that the Chinese pay in dollars. So if they say, no, you get to pay in yuan now, then that definitely helps the Chinese because they control their own currency. They don't control the dollar. The Saudis are also considering including yuan-denominated future contracts known as petro-yuan in the pricing model of Saudi Arabian oil company known as Aramco. It'd be a profound shift for Saudi Arabia to price even some of its roughly 6.2 million barrels a day of crude exports in anything other than dollars. The majority of global oil sales, around $80, are done in dollars. Saudis have traded oil exclusively in dollars since 1974, in a deal with the Nixon administration that included security guarantees for the kingdom. China introduced yuan-priced oil contracts in 2018 as part of its efforts to make its currency tradable across the world. They haven't made a dent in the dollar's dominance of the oil market. For China, using dollars has become a hazard, highlighted by the United States sanctions on Iran over its nuclear program and on Russia in response to the Ukraine invasion. So imagine, China stops holding U.S. dollars. The yuan becomes much more durable on the world markets because now it's being used in oil trade. Other countries start using yuan because they have to at least hedge between the United States and Chinese markets. And they stop denominating all of their assets in dollars. The U.S. dollar stops becoming the world's global reserve currency, and China becomes a competitor for that. That has a major impact on how, for example, the United States raises debt in the future. How do we fund all of these massive social boondoggle spending programs that we've been promising people? How do we refinance our national debt, given the fact that we're going to have to pay back all that stuff? It turns out when there's less demand for U.S. dollars, that makes the United States significantly weaker. As American power in the world markets declines, that is very bad for American citizens. Your dollar is not going to go nearly as far as it used to, and it's not going to be tradable in as many ways as it used to be tradable. The dollar has always been the best bet in terms of holdings for foreign financial entities. What if that's no longer the case? Because they are so afraid that if they cross us, we're going to freeze their assets, number one. And number two, they're looking at our foreign policy and thinking sometimes it's better to be an American enemy than to be an American ally, apparently. If you're Iran, it's better to be Iran right now than Saudi Arabia. Right now, Saudi Arabia is getting undercut by the United States. And so Saudi Arabia is turning to China. Now, all of this is necessary for the Chinese because the Chinese have to make aggressive moves. The fact is that as Xi Jinping has moved away from state capitalism and toward more autarky, he is going to need to create a harder core sphere of influence. If you're more competitive on world markets, if you're more engaged in free markets, you don't need autarky. You don't need to be solidly connected with 3 or 4 countries and you guys just create your own sphere of influence. Instead, you can engage competitively in world markets. But Xi Jinping has been moving away from that. And so that means he needs his sphere of influence. According to the Wall Street Journal last year, President Xi Jinping seemed all but invincible. Now his push to steer China away from capitalism and the West has thrown the Chinese economy into uncertainty and exposed faint cracks in his hold on power. Chinese policymakers became alarmed at the end of last year by how sharply growth had slowed after Xi tightened controls on private businesses, from tech giants to property developers. Meanwhile, China's stringent COVID lockdowns, part of Xi's approach to handling the crisis, have ramped up again as COVID cases surge, hurting both consumer spending and factory output. Add to that a pact with Russia in early February, just weeks ahead of its invasion of Ukraine, that has widened the gulf between China and the West and underlined how high the cost could be for China of implementing Xi's agenda at home and in foreign policy. But by the way, just because it's not great on just a pure economic level for China to form a sphere of influence and solidify its connections with places like Saudi Arabia and Russia and do all of that in the face of giving up market advantages in the West, that doesn't mean it's great for the United States if all of those countries fall into the Chinese sphere of influence because we are so concerned with our own navel-gazing environmental policy that we won't create energy, or we're so concerned with our navel-gazing economic policy that we blow out our debt, or we are so concerned with our navel-gazing foreign policy that we make concessions to the worst terror states on earth. There is no substitute for American strength and reliability. In the absence of American strength and reliability, the world order breaks down into spheres of influence that are really bad for Americans. And we can pretend that they're not bad for Americans, but they really, really are. And we're about to find that out in short order in pretty ugly ways, given the trajectory right now. Who's got 2 thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?